By the summer of 1942, the air war over Western Europe had settled into a costly pattern. From airfields across eastern England, Royal Air Force Bomber Command flew night after night against targets in Germany and occupied territory. By day, the United States Army Air Forces were beginning their own campaign, insisting on daylight precision bombing as a complement to the British nocturnal effort. The operational situation was defined less by ambition than by constraint. Long-range bombers could reach deep into the Reich, but fighter escort could not. Once beyond the limited radius of existing Allied fighters, bomber formations were left to defend themselves. The Royal Air Force had arrived at this conclusion earlier than most. British experience during the Battle of France and the Battle of Britain had reinforced a preference for shorter-range fighters operating close to home and for heavy bombers operating independently at night. The Supermarine Spitfire and Hawker Hurricane had proven decisive in 1940, but their limited endurance made them unsuitable for deep escort missions over Germany. RAF doctrine therefore evolved toward night bombing, electronic navigation aids, and area attacks, accepting losses as the price of persistence. The Americans arrived with different assumptions. In 1942, the 8th Air Force was still finding its footing. Its leadership believed that tight bomber formations, heavily armed with machine guns, could defend themselves in daylight without continuous escort. This belief was supported by pre-war exercises and optimistic analyses, but it had not yet been tested against the concentrated defenses of the Luftwaffe. Against this backdrop, new aircraft designs were being introduced, evaluated, and quietly judged. Among them was the North American P-51 Mustang. When the first Mustangs reached Britain in late 1941, they were not assigned to frontline RAF fighter squadrons tasked with air superiority. Instead, they were allocated to Army cooperation units, flying low-level reconnaissance and tactical support missions over occupied France. One of the officers responsible for evaluating these aircraft was Wing Commander Alan Brooks Smith, a career RAF pilot assigned in 1942 to a liaison and testing role at RAF Duxford. His work was routine rather than glamorous. He reviewed flight reports, observed trials, and prepared assessments that fed into higher-level decisions. Brooks Smith had flown Hurricanes early in the war and later transitioned to the Spitfire. He was regarded as competent, methodical, and cautious in his judgments. From his perspective, the Mustang was an oddity. It was American-built but designed for British specifications, using an Allison engine that performed well at low altitude but lost power higher up. On paper, it was fast at low level and had unusually long range for a single-engine fighter. In practice, it did not climb or fight well above 15,000 feet, where air combat over Europe often took place. RAF pilots who encountered the Mustang in this early period were not impressed. Compared to the Spitfire, it felt heavy on the controls. Its strengths were not those most valued by British fighter pilots: tight turning radius, rapid climb, and agility in dogfights. In squadron messes, the aircraft was sometimes dismissed as a ground attack machine or a reconnaissance platform, useful but unremarkable. Laughter, when it occurred, was not cruel but dismissive. The Mustang was not seen as a solution to any pressing RAF problem. Brooks Smith recorded similar sentiments in his reports. He noted the aircraft's speed at low altitude and its stability as a gun platform, but also its mediocre high-altitude performance. The Allison engine, he wrote, limits operational flexibility above medium heights. There was no suggestion that the Mustang could escort bombers deep into Germany. Such a role was not even seriously discussed within RAF circles at the time. The operational problem remained unchanged. Daylight bombing raids by the 8th Air Force were increasing in scale and ambition. Targets such as Wilhelmshaven, Bremen, and later Schweinfurt and Regensburg were selected precisely because they lay beyond the reach of existing escort fighters. American commanders argued that these targets were essential to degrading German industry. British observers were skeptical but supportive in principle. By late 1942, the consequences of inadequate escort were becoming apparent. Luftwaffe fighter units operating from well-prepared bases and guided by radar could concentrate their attacks once Allied fighters turned back. Loss rates steadily climbed.
RAF officers assigned to observe American operations noted the pattern with concern. Bomber formations held together, as doctrine required, but the cost was severe. Brooks Smith attended several briefings at which American officers defended their approach. The bombers, they argued, were bristling with guns. German fighters would suffer unacceptable losses if they pressed their attacks. RAF veterans, drawing on their own earlier experience, were unconvinced. They had learned in 1940 that bombers, however armed, were vulnerable without fighter cover. At the same time, technical developments were underway that had not yet filtered into operational doctrine. Engineers at Rolls-Royce and Packard were experimenting with installing the Merlin engine into the Mustang airframe. Early test results suggested dramatic improvements in high-altitude performance. Speed, climb rate, and ceiling all increased. Range, already a strength, was preserved. These developments were not widely known outside technical circles. Brooks Smith received a brief summary of the tests in early 1943, attached to a routine memorandum. He noted the figures with interest, but with no particular emphasis. Many promising modifications had failed to deliver under combat conditions. Caution was the norm. Within RAF command, priorities lay elsewhere. The defense of the United Kingdom, the support of upcoming operations in the Mediterranean, and preparations for a future return to the continent all demanded attention. Resources were finite. The Mustang, even in its improved form, was still viewed as an American aircraft for American use. Meanwhile, American losses continued. By the spring of 1943, 8th Air Force raids were reaching deeper into Germany with increasing frequency. Each mission produced detailed after-action reports. Fighter escort coverage was carefully mapped, showing the points at which protection ended and vulnerability began. The Luftwaffe learned these boundaries quickly and exploited them. Brooks Smith's role brought him into contact with these reports, though indirectly. As a liaison officer, he was expected to understand American capabilities and limitations and to brief RAF commanders accordingly. His assessments grew more guarded. The problem was not courage or training, he noted, but physics and fuel consumption. Fighters could not stay with the bombers long enough. Occasionally, Mustangs appeared in these discussions, usually as a footnote. Their range was mentioned, but their altitude limitations ruled them out of serious consideration. No one laughed openly in official meetings, but the aircraft was not seen as serious as a strategic escort. By mid-1943, the situation had reached a point of quiet strain. Losses were not yet catastrophic, but they were unsustainable over time. RAF and USAF planners understood this, even if they disagreed on solutions. New fighters were promised. Drop tanks extended the range of existing aircraft, but only marginally. No single change had yet altered the basic equation. Brooks Smith continued his work, observing trials, reviewing reports, and attending briefings. The Mustang, now appearing in new variants, remained on the periphery of his attention. It was an aircraft with potential, perhaps, but not one that challenged established assumptions. The routine of assessment and caution prevailed. The air war pressed on, shaped by doctrine, technology, and the limits of endurance. Solutions were being tested, but none had yet proven decisive. For the moment, the gap between ambition and capability remained, and the aircraft once laughed at sat quietly in the background, its role undefined. By late summer 1943, the operational problem that had been discussed in briefings and memoranda was no longer abstract. It was visible in squadron rosters and aircraft dispersals across eastern England. The 8th Air Force had expanded rapidly, but so had its losses. Each deep penetration mission into Germany now carried an expectation of attrition that could not be ignored, even by those most committed to the daylight bombing doctrine. Targets such as Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Kassel, and Münster lay well beyond the practical escort range of the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning as they were then employed. Drop tanks had extended reach somewhat, but not enough to provide continuous cover. Once escorts turned back, German fighters assembled in strength. They attacked methodically, often from head-on angles that minimized exposure to defensive fire. Bomber formations held together as ordered, but cohesion did not prevent loss. British observers were present at many of these operations. RAF officers embedded with the 8th Air Force recorded what they saw in formal language, but the implications were clear. Loss rates of 5 to 7% per mission were not survivable over the long term. Crews were reaching the limits of endurance before completing their tours. Replacement aircraft and men arrived, but experience was being drained away faster than it could be replenished. Wing Commander Brooks Smith's responsibilities expanded as the situation worsened. He was tasked with compiling comparative assessments of Allied fighter capabilities, not to recommend doctrine, but to clarify options. His reports increasingly emphasized range as the central constraint. Speed, armament, and maneuverability mattered, but none addressed the core problem if fighters could not stay with the bombers. The Merlin-powered Mustang appeared more frequently in technical discussions during this period. Test results were no longer confined to experimental units. Climb performance at altitude was now competitive with the Spitfire, and cruise efficiency was markedly better than any single-engine fighter then in service. Most striking was the range. With external fuel tanks, the aircraft could remain airborne far longer than its contemporaries. Still, skepticism persisted, particularly within RAF circles. The Mustang's American origins worked against it. British pilots trusted aircraft they knew, flown by units with established reputations. The Spitfire, though limited in range, was a proven interceptor. The Mustang was still seen as a newcomer, untested in sustained high-altitude combat against the Luftwaffe's best units. Brooks Smith reflected this caution in his writing. He acknowledged the improved performance figures, but warned against assuming that technical potential would translate directly into operational success. Luftwaffe tactics were adaptive, he noted, and German pilots were experienced in exploiting weaknesses. No escort fighter had yet demonstrated the ability to neutralize that advantage deep over Germany. Meanwhile, American commanders were under increasing pressure. Losses from the Second Schweinfurt raid in October 1943 were severe enough to force a temporary suspension of deep daylight missions without escort. This decision, though framed as operational prudence, marked a quiet admission that existing doctrine was insufficient. The pause intensified debate rather than resolving it. Some argued for a return to night bombing. Others insisted that daylight precision remained essential only if escort could be extended. Aircraft manufacturers and engineers were drawn into the discussion. Range, not firepower, became the most sought-after attribute. During this period, the Mustang began to appear in operational trials with the 8th Air Force. Initial deployments were cautious. Squadrons were assigned limited escort tasks, often covering bombers part way to the target before handing off to other fighters. Reports from these missions were mixed but notable. Mustang pilots reported fewer fuel concerns and greater flexibility in positioning. They could loiter ahead of formations, sweep areas where German fighters assembled, and still remain with the bombers longer than expected. These reports reached Brooks Smith through liaison channels. He noted a change in tone. Where earlier assessments had focused on limitations, newer ones emphasized adaptability. The aircraft was not superior in all respects, but it offered something others could not: endurance combined with acceptable high-altitude performance. Despite this, resistance remained. Some RAF officers questioned whether the Mustang's success was situational rather than inherent. Others pointed out that German fighter strength had been temporarily reduced by commitments elsewhere. Correlation was not causation, they argued. The Luftwaffe would adjust. Operational losses continued to test these assumptions. Even with partial escort improvements, bomber casualties remained high whenever coverage lapsed. The problem was not fully solved, only mitigated. Brooks Smith's summaries reflected this ambiguity. He did not claim success where evidence was incomplete, but he no longer dismissed the Mustang as irrelevant. By the end of 1943, the balance of discussion had shifted. The question was no longer whether extended escort was necessary, but how it could be achieved consistently. The Mustang was now central to that question, whether welcomed or not. Its earlier dismissal was being reconsidered, quietly and without public acknowledgement. For Brooks Smith, the change was gradual but unmistakable. Aircraft he had once evaluated as marginal were now being assigned roles of increasing importance. His task remained the same: observe, assess, report. Yet the operational environment around him was changing, shaped by losses that doctrine alone could not justify. The air war entered the winter with no final answers, but with assumptions under strain. The limits of existing approaches had been exposed, and alternatives were moving from theory to practice. The Mustang was no longer an afterthought, though its ultimate impact had yet to be proven.
By the opening months of 1944, the air war over Europe had entered a transitional phase. The strategic objective remained unchanged: to weaken German industrial capacity and air defenses ahead of an eventual Allied landing on the continent. What had changed was the willingness to question long-held assumptions about how that objective could be achieved. Within the 8th Air Force, the Merlin-powered P-51 Mustang was no longer an experimental curiosity. It was being issued to operational groups in growing numbers, replacing older aircraft or supplementing them. Training syllabi were adjusted to emphasize long-range escort techniques rather than short-range interception. Pilots were instructed not merely to remain close to bomber formations, but to range ahead, disrupt German fighter concentrations, and engage the enemy on more flexible terms. This approach was not yet official doctrine. It emerged through practice rather than proclamation, shaped by the realities pilots encountered in the air. Escort commanders learned that strict formation flying alongside bombers limited their ability to respond to threats. The Mustang's endurance allowed them to experiment. They could detach elements to investigate radar contacts, sweep known assembly areas, and still return to the bombers before fuel became critical. These developments were observed closely by RAF liaison officers. Wing Commander Brooks Smith, now more directly involved in comparative analysis, noted the change in operational behavior rather than the aircraft itself. In his reports, he emphasized that the Mustang's value lay not in any single performance metric, but in how it altered escort tactics. Range created options. Options created initiative. The Luftwaffe reacted quickly. German fighter leaders recognized that Allied escorts were no longer confined to predictable corridors. Encounters increasingly occurred well ahead of bomber streams or on the return leg, where German pilots had previously enjoyed relative freedom. Engagements became more dispersed and less orderly, taxing a defensive system designed around interception at specific points. Loss statistics reflected this shift unevenly at first. Some missions showed modest improvement, others little change. Weather, target selection, and German responses all influenced outcomes. Skeptics pointed to these variations as evidence that no fundamental breakthrough had occurred. Advocates argued that trends, not single missions, were what mattered. Brooks Smith occupied a careful middle ground. His assessments avoided claims of transformation, but they acknowledged a qualitative difference. Escort fighters were no longer purely reactive. The Mustang, by virtue of its endurance, allowed Allied pilots to shape engagements rather than simply endure them. The turning point for many observers came not with a single dramatic battle, but with accumulation. Missions that reached deep targets such as Leipzig and later Berlin increasingly did so with continuous escort. Losses did not disappear, but they declined to levels that crews and planners could sustain. Bomber formations returned with damage but intact. Crews completed tours that would previously have ended early. For Brooks Smith, the change became personal in a limited but meaningful way. As an RAF officer, he had initially regarded American escort practices with reserve. His professional instinct favored caution and incremental change. Yet the evidence before him was difficult to dismiss. Aircraft once regarded as unsuitable for high-altitude combat were now performing consistently in that environment. He revised his internal assessments accordingly. In memoranda circulated to RAF headquarters, he noted that the Mustang's effectiveness derived as much from how it was used as from what it was. He stopped framing its earlier limitations as defining characteristics and began describing them as historical constraints that had been addressed. This shift did not occur without friction. Some RAF officers resented the implication that an American-designed fighter had solved a problem British doctrine had sidestepped rather than solved.
Others worried that enthusiasm for long-range escort underestimated German resilience. Brooksmith recorded these concerns faithfully, but he no longer shared them to the same degree. Operational reality continued to press its case. By early March 1944, Allied bombers were reaching Berlin regularly in daylight with escort coverage that extended to and from the target. The Luftwaffe still contested these missions, but at increasing cost to itself. Experienced German pilots were being lost faster than they could be replaced. Training standards declined. Fuel shortages limited flying hours. The Mustang was not solely responsible for these developments, but it was central to them. Brooksmith's later notes emphasized that no single aircraft decided outcomes in isolation. Radar, intelligence, pilot training, and industrial capacity all played roles. Yet he acknowledged that without sustained escort, these advantages could not be fully exploited. The unofficial nature of the tactical shift remained notable. Formal doctrine lagged behind practice. Escort pilots continued to interpret orders flexibly, balancing proximity to bombers with offensive sweeps. This autonomy carried risk. Pilots who ranged too far could leave bombers exposed. Discipline and judgment became as important as fuel capacity. Brooksmith recognized this tension in his reports. He warned that success depended on restraint as well as initiative. The Mustang enabled new tactics, but it did not guarantee correct decisions. The margin for error remained narrow. As spring approached, preparations for the invasion of Western Europe intensified. Air superiority over the continent became an explicit priority. Escort fighters were now tasked not only with protecting bombers, but with wearing down the Luftwaffe itself. The Mustang's role expanded accordingly. The aircraft that once had been treated with indifference was now central to Allied air planning. This transformation had occurred without public fanfare or dramatic announcement. It emerged from accumulated experience and reluctant acceptance. For Brooksmith, the lesson was consistent with his professional outlook. Technology mattered, but only when doctrine adapted to it. The Mustang did not overturn existing beliefs overnight. It forced them to adjust, gradually and under pressure. By the end of this period, the operational problem that had defined the air war for 2 years was no longer insurmountable. It had not vanished, but it had been reframed. Escort was no longer the limiting factor it once was. The consequences of this shift were still unfolding, and resistance had not entirely disappeared. The stage was set for confrontation not only with the Luftwaffe, but within Allied institutions themselves, as new methods challenged established authority.
By late spring 1944, the consequences of extended escort were becoming unmistakable, and not all of them were welcomed uniformly. The operational success of long-range fighter cover brought with it institutional friction, particularly where established command structures and long-standing assumptions were challenged by events in the air. Within RAF Fighter Command, debates intensified over the proper balance between interception, escort, and offensive sweeps. British doctrine had evolved around defending airspace and supporting specific operations, not around sustained penetration deep into enemy territory. The Mustang's growing prominence, largely within American units, highlighted this divergence. Some RAF officers viewed the development as validation of American persistence. Others regarded it as an uncomfortable reminder that earlier British choices had accepted limitations rather than confronting them. Wing Commander Brooksmith found himself increasingly drawn into these discussions. His role as an evaluator and liaison placed him at the intersection of operational evidence and institutional caution. He was expected to brief senior officers who had built their careers around aircraft and tactics, now being supplemented and in some cases surpassed by a foreign design and an evolving method of employment. Resistance rarely took the form of open opposition. Instead, it appeared in qualifying language, requests for further validation, and emphasis on remaining uncertainties. German resistance, it was argued, was already weakening due to fuel shortages and pilot attrition. The Mustang's contribution, while useful, might be overstated. Brooksmith acknowledged these factors in his reports, but he also pointed out that German weaknesses had existed earlier without producing the same results. Operational data continued to accumulate. Escort coverage to Berlin and beyond was now routine rather than exceptional.
Loss rates for bombers declined further, while German fighter losses rose. The Luftwaffe was increasingly forced into a reactive posture, defending multiple targets simultaneously against sustained pressure. For the first time since 1940, German air defenses were being worn down faster than they could recover. The Mustang's role expanded beyond escort alone. Fighters were increasingly tasked with attacking airfields, transport, and aircraft on the ground during return legs. This shift carried risk. Flying low over hostile territory exposed pilots to ground fire and accidents. Casualties among fighter units rose, though these losses were less visible than bomber losses had been earlier. Brooks Smith noted this trade-off with characteristic restraint. The burden of risk, he observed, was shifting. Bomber crews were no longer bearing the overwhelming share of casualties. Escort fighters, enabled by range and endurance, were assuming greater responsibility and exposure. This redistribution of risk was central to the new approach, even if it was not framed that way in official summaries. Pushback also emerged around command authority. The flexibility exercised by escort pilots, particularly American group commanders, sometimes conflicted with centralized control. RAF officers accustomed to tighter oversight expressed concern that decentralized decision-making could lead to gaps in coverage or unnecessary engagements. Incidents were cited where bombers were briefly exposed while fighters pursued enemy aircraft elsewhere. These incidents prompted reviews and revised instructions, but they did not reverse the underlying trend. The advantages of initiative were judged to outweigh the risks. Brooks Smith's assessments supported this view, though he emphasized the need for disciplined execution rather than unrestrained aggression. As preparations for the Normandy landings reached their final stages, the air campaign's priorities sharpened. Gaining and maintaining air superiority over northern France became paramount. The Mustang's range allowed it to escort bombers attacking rail yards, bridges, and coastal defenses, while also engaging German fighters wherever they appeared. The Luftwaffe's ability to contest airspace over the invasion area was steadily eroded. Institutional acceptance followed operational necessity. RAF planners incorporated long-range escort assumptions into their coordination with American forces. The Mustang's presence was no longer debated, it was planned for. Earlier skepticism receded, not through concession, but through habit. What had once seemed unconventional became routine. For Brooks Smith, this period marked the peak of professional tension. He was no longer evaluating a possibility, but documenting an established practice whose implications extended beyond any single aircraft. His reports reflected a careful balance, recognition of success without triumphalism, acknowledgement of remaining risks without undue caution. The stakes were now evident. Allied air power was shaping the conditions under which ground operations would unfold. The effectiveness of escort fighters influenced not only bomber survival, but the broader balance of air superiority. Errors could have consequences measured not in aircraft alone, but in the success of the invasion itself. By early June 1944, the framework of the air campaign was set. The Mustang was embedded within it, accepted as a necessary component rather than an object of debate. The laughter and indifference of earlier years were absent, replaced by routine reliance. Yet, the institutional adjustments that followed success were incomplete. Questions of credit, doctrine, and future planning remained unresolved. The immediate task, however, was clear, and there was little time for reflection as events moved forward. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, the question of long-range escort had ceased to be theoretical. The airspace over northern France and western Germany was no longer contested on the same terms as it had been a year earlier. German fighter units still flew, still fought, and still inflicted losses, but they no longer dictated when and where engagements occurred. That shift, gradual and uneven, shaped the final year of the air war. The P-51 Mustang was now fully integrated into Allied operations. It escorted bombers to targets across Germany, including Berlin, Leipzig, and Dresden, and remained with them on the return leg. It also conducted independent sweeps, attacked airfields, and intercepted German fighters attempting to regroup. None of this was described at the time as revolutionary. In official language, it was presented as the logical extension of improved capability and coordination. Wing Commander Alan Brooks Smith continued his work through this period, compiling assessments that increasingly focused on outcomes rather than possibilities. His later reports were less concerned with whether the Mustang could perform its role and more with how its employment affected broader operational planning. Escort availability influenced target selection, timing, and bomber routing. Fighter endurance became a planning constant rather than a constraint. The Luftwaffe's decline accelerated through the second half of 1944. Fuel shortages limited training and operations. Experienced pilots were lost faster than replacements could be trained. Aircraft production continued, but machines without fuel or skilled crews offered little resistance. Allied escorts encountered fewer organized interceptions and more isolated attacks, often by undertrained pilots. Brooks Smith avoided attributing this decline to any single cause. In his summaries, he emphasized cumulative pressure, sustained bombing, attrition of experienced personnel, and the erosion of German operational flexibility. The Mustang featured prominently, but as part of a system rather than a singular solution. Its range allowed pressure to be applied continuously and predictably, leaving fewer opportunities for German recovery. Institutionally, acceptance of the Mustang was complete by this stage. RAF officers who had once questioned its relevance now worked alongside American units that relied on it daily. British pilots flew the aircraft themselves in growing numbers. Earlier skepticism was rarely acknowledged explicitly. There was little appetite for revisiting debates that events had already settled. The air war continued into 1945 with diminishing resistance. Bomber losses fell further, though accidents and flak remained hazards. Escort fighters encountered fewer adversaries, but missions remained demanding. Long hours in the cockpit, weather and fatigue took their toll. The Mustang's endurance, once a novelty, became an expectation. As Germany's defeat approached, attention shifted to post-war assessments. Analysts reviewed aircraft performance, production decisions, and doctrinal evolution. The Mustang's role was described in measured terms. It was recognized as an effective long-range escort, well suited to the conditions of late-war Europe. Claims of inevitability were avoided. Reports noted that its success depended on timing, industrial capacity, and the willingness to adapt tactics. Brooks Smith contributed to these assessments before returning to a more conventional command role. His career did not hinge on the Mustang, nor did he become publicly associated with its rise. His work remained largely anonymous, embedded in staff papers and internal memoranda. This anonymity was typical. The air war was shaped by many such figures, whose influence was cumulative rather than dramatic. In the immediate aftermath of the war, public narratives favored clear heroes and decisive moments. The Mustang featured in these accounts, often contrasted with earlier Allied limitations. Simplified stories circulated, suggesting sudden realizations or dramatic reversals. Within professional circles, the picture was more restrained. The aircraft was understood as the product of incremental improvement, effective deployment, and sustained effort. British attitudes toward the Mustang settled into quiet respect. It was no longer laughed at, nor was it mythologized. It occupied its place alongside other aircraft that had performed their tasks well under demanding conditions. Its legacy was practical rather than symbolic. For the men who planned, flew, and evaluated these operations, the lesson was consistent with broader wartime experience. Problems rarely yielded to single solutions. They were addressed through persistence, adaptation, and the willingness to revise assumptions when evidence accumulated. The Mustang did not overturn doctrine by itself. It forced doctrine to respond. By the end of the conflict, the operational problem that had once defined the daylight bombing campaign had been resolved to the extent that circumstances allowed. Bombers could reach deep targets with acceptable losses. Escort fighters could remain with them throughout the mission. Air superiority over Western Europe had been secured. This outcome owed much to industrial capacity, training, and coordination across Allied forces. Within that framework, the Mustang played a critical role, not as a miracle weapon, but as a tool used effectively once its potential was understood and its limitations addressed. Its acceptance story is therefore not one of sudden insight, but of gradual recognition. Early dismissal gave way to cautious interest, then to reliance, and finally to routine use. Laughter faded, not because opinions changed overnight, but because results accumulated. In that sense, the Mustang's history reflects the nature of the air war itself, shaped less by singular moments than by sustained pressure, quiet decisions, and the steady adjustment of men and institutions.